So, let us now discuss texture painting. The texture painting panel is located at the top of the screen. So let's open this panel. On the right, we have the option of selecting the brush to use, as we will see shortly. The texture we want to draw on will appear here on the left. We don't have a texture yet, but we'll get one soon. There are also these geometrical components that are visible. They are the UV map of our object. For those who are unfamiliar, the UV map is a two-dimensional projection of our object's faces. This is used to establish the correspondence between the texture we will apply and the 3D object's related faces. This circle, for example, represents the object's base. So, if we load a texture to apply to our model, Blender recognizes that this portion of the texture should be applied to the object's base. Similarly, this represents the top of our model. So, when we paint in this area or load an image below, Blender recognizes that this portion of the texture needs to be applied here. We won't go into detail about UV map here because it's a topic that deserves its own explanation. I mention it only to explain what these geometric elements are. The first step in getting started with texture painting is to create a new texture to paint on. For the time being, we have this noise texture that defines the base material. The first step is to create a new texture which will be used for painting. Return to shading mode and add a new texture. It will be the sheet on which we will draw. Let's select Texture Image from the Texture menu. This is a texture that is completely empty. Think of this as a Photoshop layer which we use to paint. And our final material can be thought of as a series of overlapping layers. So we have a new layer. After that, we must define the different properties. The next step is to make a new image and give it a name. We can call it Rust because this is the layer where we will create the rust. The resolution must then be set. 1024 by 1024 is fine, but we can increase the resolution for greater detail. The other parameters, such as alpha channel and blank background, can be left as they are. That means the texture will be completely black. The texture has been created. And right now, it's obviously going to be an empty texture. Nothing is visible because the texture is not connected to the material. In order to see it, I have to connect the color to the base color, and then the material becomes completely black. That is clearly not what we want. We'd like to combine these two materials. But for the time being, let's connect this texture to the base color to better understand how texture painting works. Return to the Texture Painting panel. We can see that the texture that we just created has been loaded here on the left. And it is here that we can select which images to load. In this case, we're using the image we created in the shader. So, we're going to use this as the image to paint. The brush section is on the right. In the Texture Slots tab, we can choose which layer to paint on. And, once again, we select the Rust node we created. In fact, imagine we've added several textures, like this, to the node panel. I need to decide which of these to paint on. Here we have the option of selecting the type of brush as well as its size. In the brush's settings, we specify the radius and color. We can specify the color, size, and radius. The quickest method is to hold down the F key and move the mouse. We can change the size of the brush in this manner. This allows us to paint directly on the 3D model, which is extremely convenient. On the left, we always see the same texture in 2D. So, the relationship between the texture and the UV map is very clear. This two-dimensional projection, for example, corresponds to the lower portion of my object. It's as if we cut the various elements that make up the object with scissors. The pieces are then arranged on a two-dimensional plane. In fact, if I draw below, the area that is colored is exactly this one that corresponds to this face. We can paint directly on the texture or on the three-dimensional model. Keep in mind that when we want to paint on the texture, we must select Paint from the menu. Otherwise, we won't be able to paint. If you paint in areas that do not correspond to any of the faces, the paint will not appear anywhere. This is the foundation of what texture painting implies. So we've learned how to paint. But we now have a problem. Now we only see the texture I just made, which is the rust layer. We don't see the underlying texture, which was essentially this one with the noise. So we'll see how to combine two textures and then layer them on top of each other. This is made possible by a node that allows us to blend two textures together. To get to this node, press the Shift key and open the color group. Select Mix RGB from this menu. In this node, there are two inputs. As a result, you can combine two images. Let's connect the layer below to Color 2, and the layer above to Color 1, and the output to the principled shader. As a result, the two textures are combined. We can also do something else. The blend factor is shown here. We can then decide how the two textures should be mixed together. If we set it to 0, we only see the top texture. When we set it to 1, we see the bottom layer. With intermediate values, we see a mix between the two. The issue with the mix is that it alters the opacity of the textures. So, for example, we can see that the purple is faded because we reduced its opacity. So, in situations like this, where the texture has a black background, use the Add Blending method. And you can clearly see how the color has improved. The Screen Blending method can also be used. In other words, as implied by the name, the light is added when using these blending techniques, such as the screen methods and others. This means that a black area becomes completely transparent. As a result, it has no effect on the underlying image because it is equivalent to zero light. Lighter areas, on the other hand, are added to the underlying image. This is similar to the blending methods found in photo editing software. Then we can decide how to blend the two layers. As a result, we have two overlapping textures. At this point, if I return to texture painting, we can actually paint and see the final effect of the mix in real time. Let's take a quick look at the basic texture painting options. We've already seen the base color, which can be changed using the color picker. The strength parameter, which denotes the proper level of brush intensity, is important. It's similar to defining the transparency of a brush stroke. Another important aspect that we will cover later is how to use a texture in a mask. We will need this to draw these rust spots. The stroke section is where we have one more option. Here we set the brush type. We can choose what properties the brush should have. We are currently employing the space method. This means that each stroke is spaced according to the percentage specified here. With low values, it is as if we are drawing a continuous stroke. We can obviously draw lines with the line method, which is very useful for defining geometric elements. We then have a whole series of parameters that we can set. The Stabilize Stroke option is especially interesting. We can now stabilize the drawing. While drawing, you can clearly see it. The curve is modified to have a smoother pattern. Let's take another example by reducing the size of the brush. You can see how the curve changes and follows a much smoother path. Then we have several options. We can, for example, draw symmetrically. Let's start by doing some cleaning. The best way to clean up a texture is to erase and fill with solid color. So let's click the Fill button, and in the Properties panel, set the fill color to black. Furthermore, set the value of threshold to 1. When we click, the entire area is filled. This is due to the fact that we set a threshold equal to 1 in order to color all of the brightness levels present. By activating symmetry, we can paint in this way with interesting results. Basically, we have all of the standard photo retouching functions. I have one very important suggestion for you. As we've seen, the brush section is where we configure the various properties. When we make a brush, it is saved with the properties we specify. It then becomes useful to rename each brush individually. This makes it easier for us to reuse the various brushes. I'll give you an example. Let's fill everything black again. Suppose we want to have 2 types of brushes, one blue in color and with other properties that we can define. I rename the brush, say, blue. I also restored the original brush settings. Now I want to define another brush. For instance, a yellow color with a different size and other features. To accomplish this, I don't edit this brush, but I create another one. And now I'm going to add some more properties. When I open the preview window, we can see the 2 brushes we just made. We can then create a collection of brushes to use for various purposes. We can then delete the texture again, so we can start creating the rest. And we'll see this in the following videos.